As we continue now with the eighth session of our study, and we look at Genesis 20 through 22, we find, first of all, another occasion when Abraham passes his wife off as his sister, a rather extensive story here with the story of Abimelech. And then in chapter 21, we have the birth of Isaac and the parting from Hagar and Ishmael, and the promise of a blessing for Ishmael's family as well. And then the story of what is called the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac, where God commands Abraham to give his son back when he is 13 years old, and the subsequent story about the family of Abraham that is still back in Haran. So as we look at the story, we start with the story of Abimelech. Interestingly, the man's name means "my father is king." In this time period, we have what's known as city-states. We're in probably what's called the Middle Bronze Age. And in city-states, that meant that you had a particular city that was usually on a quite high hill and probably with water supply near it. And you would have then people who would be nearby who would have contact because of that central region where they would keep their possessions and everything, and where the person who was ruling there was able to control the land. We don't seem to have that as much in the land of Gerar. And the country of Gerar is sort of like down around the Gaza Strip, kind of southwest in Israel on the way down toward Egypt. And we remember that in chapter 12, Abraham had passed his wife off as his sister, and now he does that again. So twice, and then we're going to see a third time with the story of Isaac, that he also is said to have passed his wife off, Rebekah, to Abimelech. Now, what that might mean is, much like the word Pharaoh means the guy in the big house, Abimelech might be a sort of a title that would go with every king. That the king is my father is another way that we could say that, and might mean thereby that they simply had a name for a ruler, that he was the head over the whole family as a father would be head over an individual family. So it might be a title, and that seems to happen from time to time. What I find very intriguing about this story is how much God is involved with talking to others besides those in the family of Abraham. As we've looked at a little bit before, we don't have many hints of this, but here we have a man to whom God speaks. And we have a man who is somehow aware, at least once God is speaking to him, that he is trying to be a righteous man. We don't have many indications of this during the Middle Bronze Age, but here's a man who is trying to be righteous before God, and is trying to live an upstanding life, and yet he has a harem. And we are surprised if this is when Sarah's 99 years old. What in the world is she being taken in someone's harem for? No answers are given to that. But Abraham then, who has said, "You're my sister, so tell them you're my sister." We have the same father, just not the same mother, so technically it's true. But Abraham is willing to let his wife be taken and to have sexual relations with his king. This is not exactly the high point of the story of Abraham, and we need neither pull him down or elevate him too high. He is a real human being, one through whom God will work, but one through whom God works in spite of who he is. So Abraham lets his wife be taken into the harem and tells her, as they had in every other place of the sojourning, "You do this for me." As I mentioned when we looked at Genesis 12, we're not exactly sure what all of the very detailed background of this is. One interesting thing about the story here at this point is that as Abraham passes his wife off as his sister, he is talking about a concept of God as a God of place rather than a God of people. That's what humans in their sinful condition do, is they say, well, God's over here, and our life is over here, so that we have a sanctuary for us. In church, we might think differently and talk differently and have a different framework for what we discuss than out in the world. Remember that the story of the Spirit coming upon all of us, we are told that we are all temples of the Holy Spirit, and wherever we go, there God goes with us. And this notion that God is here with me in the land he promised, but if I go somewhere else, then he's not with me, is a question that has plagued Judaism, first of all, throughout the ages. The story of Esther was a story of God blessing people when they were in the country of Persia. Could God bless people if they were elsewhere? There are parts of Isaiah where the comment is really being made. God can bless the people even if they're taken into exile. They don't all have to be in the land of promise for God to bless them. Joseph, by almost the very opposite way of the way we see Abraham, his great grandpa, working, Joseph will go down into Egypt and say to Potiphar's wife, I cannot do this great wickedness and sin against God, against Elohim, the generic word for God. Notice how Abimelech also is told that God kept him from sinning. This is a magnificent little concept here, that God says, I can work on the hearts of people to get them to think they're doing something when I really am maybe hindering them from doing evil. Abimelech's conversation with God is just a very comfortable kind of a story. The man says, I'm trying to do the best I can, and here this fellow lies to me, doesn't tell me the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and here I could have sinned against you, and God says, no, I put it in your mind not to do that. But we also get this little hint. Well, what was going on? None of the women, none of the servant girls were having babies. Something's amiss. Something's wrong. And the people in that day and age always had an awareness that they're in the presence of the deity, whichever god they worshipped, and we're not told in Abimelech's case who that is. So these people are not bearing children. They're wondering what's going on. And when God comes to speak to Abimelech, he says, Abraham is a prophet. First time we get that word prophet. Not in the sense of a speaker on behalf of God, but here more in the sense of one who can pray. You'll notice that God says he can pray for you and you'll be delivered from this sin that you almost committed. So Abraham is the go-between, the pleader, and rather surprising at this point, that Abraham, who has done the tricking, who has lied, is the one who goes and prays to God, and that Abimelech, in, quote, getting himself off the hook, gives Abraham 1,000 shekels of silver. One would expect that it should have been the other way around, that Abraham should have given money to King Abimelech for having lied to him about who his wife was. So a lot of very strange things here. It reminds me also that in the biblical stories we do have cases where people outside of that technical little covenant also do have a relationship with God. You might remember this is really played off also against the immediately preceding story about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where those people had actually been blessed and redeemed by God through Abraham, and instead of blessing him, then they go the other way, and they continue to be wicked to Lot and his family and the guests, and then finally the city is destroyed. So we have an account here about the interactions. We'll later see some more of the story about Abraham's interactions with Abimelech. We might just mention those at this point. It's the whole thing about those who bless you I will bless, and those who curse you I will curse. Well, what does Abimelech say? He says, it's kind of good, Abraham, for you to be near me. It's almost as if God's bringing the blessings on you and I'm standing right nearby, then the blessings come to me as well. So Abimelech is kind of in awe of Abraham, unlike when Abraham is in awe of God before Melchizedek, the king up in Jerusalem. Remember that Melchizedek, the Melchi, is the same as this Abimelech here, so the name king is in both of those, a ruler over a kind of a smaller area. So anyway, there is, Abraham moves, but then there is this relationship that's established, and they establish a covenant. The covenants that we usually think of are between the Almighty God and human beings, but this one's what they would call a little bit more of a parity treaty. Each of them are on an equal level, and the way in which they seal this is with an animal sacrifice. They are bosom buddies, they are friends, they are willing to eat a meal together, and then saying they're willing to die for each other. But the digging of a well where Abraham finally can stay at the city of Beersheba has caused a lot of great interest at that particular site, and the evidence specifically for Abraham being there probably is never going to turn up because he was a sojourner. But that's where Kathy and I lived for a couple of months at Tel Sheva, at the ancient site of the city of Beersheba, back in 1972 when we were on an archaeological dig. And it's a very, very high kind of a hill. It's, I would guess, maybe 60, 70, 80 feet in elevation. And that's the way the ancient cities, the tells, were mounds where it was maybe a little hillock, and then because they had water there, then they kept on building on top of it, kind of like a layer cake, though that's rather simplified version of the idea. And they kept building on top of it, and so when an archaeologist tries to dig, he or she may cut a slice in part of that mount or hill as they did, and then also go from the top on down to see if they can uncover the remains of certain eras. Um, and there were people at the site that we dug at about 15 miles to the east from this same time period. And so there were people living here. There were plastered floors by that point already. This is not like the Wild West where you may not see anybody for a long time. There's a settled community already then in which Abraham is living. Well, we go on in the story then to finally the birth of Isaac in chapter 21. And the word Isaac means laugh. I was speaking with a student recently who just came back from Israel, and she's always giggling, and she said the first word that they taught her in Arabic was the word yidak. And the D and the TS are very similar, and so yitzak and yidak are the same word, to laugh or be giggly or be happy. And obviously a 90-year-old woman having a baby, everyone, even in that era, is going to laugh and say, who ever heard of such a thing like that? So Isaac's name means the laugher. Chapter 20, we see that the main character in the story is probably more Abimelech than Abraham. Now the main character in the story is going to go back to being Abraham, but there is a tension. Now what happens to the two boys? Isaac, of course, is the child of promise, and the promised one appears, and then you get rid of the ones who no longer count. And so Hagar herself says to, or Sarah herself says to Hagar and Ishmael, I want you out of here. You might remember that Hagar had fled when Ishmael was a baby because Sarah had been very harsh with her. Now this time when she flees, she does not return. And she finds a son, or a wife for her son, you might notice, from Egypt. So there is an intermarrying there. No more contact or comment about the relationship with Abraham after this point. No more contact or comment really about Hagar after this point. But the story is set in Genesis that very often there will be several characters, and then as one character leaves the scene, as Ishmael in this case, then there'll be sort of an end to that story, and kind of you pull the string around the story and tie up the bag and say, okay, he went off by himself. We'll see a little bit about Ishmael at another point, but not a whole lot more. So Hagar and Ishmael leave. Once again, as previously, God says, I'll be with you and your son as well. And so speaks also to the servant girl. God says everyone counts. Even if they are wicked against him, they all count. And whether it is Abraham being wicked against God, or the Pharaoh being wicked against Abraham, or Abraham being wicked against the Pharaoh, it is not as if God automatically hates anyone whom he has made. He may say to those who want to be in charge and say, I've got to have control over everything. No, you don't. So he will later say to the Pharaoh, you cannot be in charge of the whole world. But at this point, as Isaac is born, we don't hear much about the naming of the child. We don't hear much about, like, even the circumcision. But we are told then about the split that takes place as Ishmael and his mother leave, and as he starts his own family. And then we move into the account of the story of the binding of Isaac. And we've looked a little bit at some of the other setting already that is around this story, as Abraham is living in the context of Gerar and Beersheba. But now I think we ought to look a little bit at this story in chapter 22. Abraham has failed at very important times. He's in some ways kind of like one of the disciples, like Peter. He has had the chance to be faithful, and he has been faithful some, but there are times when he falls flat on his face. The tension of chapter 20, where he has lied about Sarah being his sister instead of his wife, or leaving that impression. Now what's going to happen? He's lied twice about his wife being his sister. He's tried to help God out by suggesting Eliezer could be his heir. He has tried to help God out by impregnating Sarah's maidservant Hagar, and God kept saying, no, I have a plan. I'm going to do it my own way, my own time. And once Isaac is born, and then he grows up to about the time of when you would have a bar mitzvah in later times, where you'd know how to be responsible to God. Of course, there's no Torah written here. At this time, then God says, give him back. Now, Jewish tradition has kind of really gone wild with this, because God tells Abraham to go up to the mountains of Moriah. The only other time the word Moriah is mentioned in the Old Testament is in a passage in Genesis, or in Chronicles, which talks about Mount Moriah as the place where the temple is. And that has caused a lot of people to say that that rock in the dome of the rock in Jerusalem was the actual stone on which on which Abraham had laid Isaac when God stopped him so that he wouldn't kill him. But what we're really finding out here is not that God says, I want you to go kill your firstborn. What we really find is God saying to Abraham, you need to take me at my word. You need to acknowledge that I am the one who is calling you to do something, no questions asked. This is not our view of religion in our society. People today say, I think I ought to be able to decide for myself what I want to do. That's what Abraham had been doing, and what apparently got him into trouble at times, at least with God. God was not blessing him for those kinds of events. But this Akedah, this binding of Isaac, is such a touching scene. Take your son, your only son, your beloved son, and give him back to me. The New Testament suggests that Abraham knew that God could raise Isaac from the dead. But as you read the text in Genesis, you at least notice that at that point there is nothing about it. But the parallels with the New Testament are just very, very obvious. Here's Isaac carrying the burden of the wood on his back as he is going up to the mountains of Moriah, asks an innocent question about where is the sacrifice coming, and gets this rather veiled answer, my son, the Lord will provide for all this. Abraham sets his servants aside, and so we can assume from this it was not a very common thing, even in those days, that a father would sacrifice his son. Abraham doesn't want anyone else watching. By the place where he goes, at least there must be some kind of a shaded or sheltered area, because I don't think even then that we would have had a man who could convince everyone standing around that the deity, that God wanted him to kill his boy, and that was why he was doing it. This passage, as much as any in the Old Testament, bothers lots of Christians. How can God tell people to kill their own kids? And that's not the point of it. The point of the story is God is saying to Abraham, figure out now, are you going to trust me, or are you going to still try and be in charge? And so in many ways, this is the high point of the Abraham story. It's where he says, God, you are God, do with me according to your word. Well, Abraham then goes up with Isaac, and as he's ready to stab him and come down and kill him and burn him up to God, finally saying, I guess I simply have to do this, that's what God calls me to do, then God sends a messenger and says, no, don't do that. We find in the New Testament the only place where we have this parallel to your only son, your beloved son, are the words that come right after Jesus' baptism. And anyone who knew this story was going to know that there was a parallel there. Take your son, your only son, your beloved son, and offer him on the mountains of Moriah. And where is Jesus going to be offered? On the mountains of Moriah, on an old rugged cross outside the city of Jerusalem. He is going to be put up on that cross. the God who spares Abraham's son Isaac does not spare his only son. And so at the same time, that we recognize how horrendous this looks of what God told Abraham to do to his son, we realize that God chooses this very, very unconventional way to save and redeem all of us. The New Testament talks so often about there's no salvation without blood being shed. And God does not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all that we might have life. That's not here yet, though. That's something we can see in retrospect. It's not as if anyone who would have read the story of Genesis 22 would have said, well, I know that's talking about the Savior who's going to come someday. That's not there. What is there is a final faithfulness of Abraham, that he's willing to do what God called him to. And what God really wants is for people to say, you're God, I'm your child, you lead me to do what you would want me to do, rather than me coming up with my own answers of what I think my life ought to be. And this being, bearing our cross, or denying ourself, denying that we are in charge of everything, is really the way in which we worship God. We are all called to do that kind of listening. What does God want to do with me, rather than what do I want to do with my own life, and how much do I have to dab God's way till he's off my back and says, okay, you've done enough, now go play. That our whole life, everything that we do, is lived in his presence and is something that can be offered up to him. So as we come to the conclusion of this section, we also see that there are relatives mentioned about Abraham's relatives back in Haran. That's going to be important because the next thing that happens is Sarah will die, and then we need a wife for Isaac. And Abraham will not go to the Canaanites in the land, even if he's had good success with Abimelech. He will send back to the mother country, the land where his relatives are, and marry Isaac to a cousin of his. Now that's for what we're going to look at next week, but that's the reason why all of this is mentioned at the very end, and we'll see Bethuel and Rebekah's relatives mentioned here at the very end as well. So as we continue the story, we continue to see the heart of human beings. Abimelech, an unbeliever who seeks to be righteous, and God blesses him at least to protect him and his family. Abraham, who is trying to still protect his own skin, God loves him in spite of it. Hagar, who is cast away from her mother, or her the mistress that she serves, and yet God says, I watch out for her. And we might remember that in the story in Galatians, there is a comparison made with Hagar being the old covenant and Sarah being the new covenant. And Paul even says, cast out the handmaid and her son. Get rid of that covenant because a better one has come, and uses Hagar to represent the Abraham covenant, and then uses Sarah to represent the new covenant in Jesus, that particular seed from Abraham that brings a new and deeper and eternal relationship. So there's a lot of, many of the themes that are here will be picked up elsewhere in the New Testament. It's a rather exciting section because we see also the interaction with God and his people. I might just mention in conclusion that Jewish tradition has not only said that that rock was where Abraham sought to kill Isaac at God's command, but it's also said by some that that's the very rock where Adam and Eve were shaped, and of course that's the rock that Jewish tradition says was the place where the Holy of Holies was put, so that the 10 words in the covenant box were stored there as well, where God was merciful to his people and where they hoped he would be merciful again. And of course that's the rock that's named in the dome of the rock where the Muslim shrine is still today. So with all of that mixture of all those different kinds of things, we see the reason why the tensions are not going to be resolved very easily. Thank you for your continued study, and we will conclude this particular part of the study of the first half of the book of Genesis next week. Thank you. God go with you.